Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Big Picture Film Club podcast. Today's episode, we're joined by writer, director Oliver Murray, whose latest documentary, Ronnie's, looks at the history behind Ronnie Scott's, the world famous jazz club based in Soho, London. Oliver, how are you doing?
Hi. Yeah, very well, thanks. Nice to be here.
Uh, I had the privilege of seeing Ronnie's live, your documentary. I have like a particular affinity to the venue myself. Like I'd been there, I think 2 or 3 times, and a good friend of mine who was a music artist had the actual pleasure of performing there as well, upstairs, not in the main room.
Yeah.
And I'd got to we had a number of songs together, so I got to kind of perform one as well. And
Oh,
so,
cool.
yeah, so I'd kind of got a sense of what um, Ronnie's, the history behind Ronnie Scott's.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting, like the first time sort of going into the venue, it's almost unassuming from the front, and
Yeah.
then you kind of walk in and then you see all these pictures and you're like, the very first time, plead ignorance, like I didn't know why the pictures of these all famous musicians were there. Was it just to kind of pay
Yeah.
homage? Then you're like, oh no, these are people who've been here. This is recording history on the walls.
Yeah.
um and it just has a very kind of fantastic, warm vibe to it. And so kind of when I heard about your documentary, I was like, I have to check it out. And so I'm keen to know, like, what was your sort of, I guess, relationship with the venue, and to be like,
Yeah.
you know what, let's tell this story.
Mm. Well, to be honest with you, it wasn't something that it wasn't a project that I generated myself. So it's sort of projects sometimes that you have this burning desire, and this sort of sense of this clarity that you feel it's time to tell a certain story. But this was a producer friend of mine who has been wanting to tell the story for a while, and he pitched it to me over a cup of coffee in Soho. And immediately, the thing that excited me was working in Soho so often. I walk past that place all the time, and I'd been a couple of times, but it was immediately kind of like the mission, if you like, was really exciting, which was I wanted to know more about the man behind the name, principally, and to kind of enjoy that. It starts quite indulgently, that I wanted to know more, and I know that my friends and colleagues all want to know more as well. So I felt like I was the audience for this. I wasn't the guy
Mm.
with uh, a um, a long-standing relationship with the club. I didn't have a particularly in-depth knowledge of British jazz. I love music. I've worked in music for a good few years now, but the opportunity to learn and to present the story of the club and the man to a younger audience than you might expect was my take on it. That's what I said I would set out to do, and the guys at Goldfinch sort of backed that vision of that version of the film. So in October 2018, I started reading and watching and sitting at the back of that place and just absorbing as much as I could, and we started from there.
I mean, it's interesting you kind of did sort of talk about just now the kind of finding out more about the Ronnie Scott himself, because it feels, and this is in no disrespect, but it almost feels like two documentaries. It feels like a documentary about the establishment, the venue, Ronnie Scott's, and the person behind it, and his business partner and friend Pete King,
Yeah.
and those two documentaries sort of interplay side by side, and they're kind of woven throughout this whole entire film. And I feel that you perhaps can't fully tell the whole story, and without both parts.
Yeah,
Would that be a fair summary? Or?
definitely. It's always tricky with storytelling, not just documentaries, but to tell the story of an institution.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of come as your friend early on because there's a rich history of places and everything, but ultimately we need characters. I think like any kind of narrative, character is what we're drawn to. Otherwise, you may have an interesting plot about how a place developed and people coming in and out of that story, but the anchor, the emotional anchor, had to be an individual. I'd sort of learned that the hard way early on in short films, and just as I was sort of coming up through the ranks making things. That's I think always the way to go. And then it just seemed like you couldn't tell the story of the club without providing the foundation of Ronnie. And as you so the club was founded in 1959. So I kind of thought, well, okay, you need to understand a bit about bebop and the music that they wanted to play there, why it was so hard. Then you need to understand the kind of context of Soho and London at that time, and then I think that's the hardest juggling act, really. That there are lots of interesting threads, and you sort of need to be, I think, disciplined, and then hopefully by telling the strongest story that discerning viewers understand that there are rabbit holes that you could have gone down, but ultimately that would be to the detriment of the piece as a whole. Sometimes it's maybe one of my most frustrating. Yeah. I mean, I think everyone would like to have the resources to be able to make some sort of 8-part epic with just pots and pots of money, which equals all the time in the world. So the frustrating part is the things that you can't tell. The story of New York, even at the time, which is crucial. We sort of provide the key ingredients to understand what it was that Ronnie was trying to recreate. Really, a American style, a New York jazz club in London. So you can make a whole film about that, but I don't think it would have been as emotionally strong. I don't think it would have had the ride, and I don't think it would have allowed for such fantastic performances to be woven into the story and give it such emotional support. That's kind of it's hard. It's a long answer to a short question, but I think that is the hardest. You have all these sort of strands of spaghetti, and it gets very messy very quickly, and the main task is to filter out other parts of the narrative that are really fascinating, but you just having that discipline, and I think it's a taste thing of just making sure you're telling what you feel is the strongest and most interesting story.
And on that note of characters, I mean, it's clear from the documentary Ronnie Scott himself was, I guess, many things to many people.
Yeah.
And how would you describe who Ronnie Scott was?
I think Ronnie's your classic old school entertainer, in that he had an ability, no matter how he felt, he could get up on that stage and perform didn't matter what demons he was battling or what issues he had with the club or whatever. If you bought a ticket to go to the club, whether he was playing or just being the compere, you got Ronnie Scott, the entertainer. I think that was the thing that set him apart from just. I mean, he was a very good player. I think that's in a way that he's sort of underrated a bit. I think he's the second best saxophone player of that era, second to Tubby Hayes. And so, as I say, yeah, an entertainer and a proper musician of the old school variety, where they came out of the Second World War with nothing other than a passion to play music. They didn't have what I think can be a blessing and a curse these days, is that if you can get a laptop with a few bits and pieces, you can start getting an entire album together of music. But money is sort of talked about too often, I think, in the music industry now. And he, above everything else, was a saxophone player, I think. I sort of, although obviously I never met the guy, kind of getting to know him through his letters and his interviews and the material, I think that is what he would like to be remembered as. So that was in the back of my mind when we were making this doc, is he's a very complex man, but at the end of the day, if he was here now talking to us, he would say, look, I started as a saxophone player and I still am a saxophone player above everything else.
Awesome. And on that, you kind of touched on kind of looking at his like reading letters and interviews, and I must say, like the amount of kind of archive footage, music that you kind of put together is very, like, it's a very rich archive of information you've really threaded together really well. How was it like sourcing all that that much material about the venue, and not only that, like sort of the just even some of the cutaway shots of London at that time? I mean, how was that process like?
Long. I mean, we started the very first thing that we did in October 2018 was just kind of work hard to get the information out there that this film is coming together. That's always, I think, the most important thing, is communicating to the people that can help you and the people that know where this stuff is, if it exists at all. And they, you know, some things are easy to find, like the BFI has some beautiful material of Soho, for instance, or places like Pathé and you know, newsreel material is beautifully shot. You know, shooting Soho at night in the 50s is not technically an easy thing to do, like, you know, with the exposure. And so I'm always amazed at how technically accomplished that archive material, you know, the way that stuff is put together is beautiful. So it's there and it's looked after for that reason. And then it's just balancing that with asking family and friends of the people in the doc for, you know, that everyone has a shoebox of stuff under the bed and things like that. And it takes a little while to gain their trust, as, you know, you or I would not give away that kind of stuff lightly. So time, it's the most precious resource, I think, in being able to make a film like Ronnie's, is time to find people, reach out to them, not rushing them in their decision if they want to be involved or not. And obviously it helps that Ronnie was such a charismatic and loved individual, because to be honest, the people the really special people that got involved because of him, not because of me. You know, I'm aware of that fact that Quincy Jones and Sonny Rollins and Michael Parkinson and all those kind of people they were reminiscing about an old friend, and I think you know, they knew that this is probably the last bus that was coming along to tell us his story. The guys and girls in the film are, for the most part, in their 80s and even in their 90s, because, you know, of this being a sort of the origin of this story starting out in the 50s. It's these people need time to decide whether they want to be a part of it, and they want to see it done properly, because if they get the sense that it's not done properly, then they're gone. You know, and you don't get any second chances. So,
and with that, how much can you plan from the start in terms of collating material together and archive material before you go, all right, Quincy, can we do an interview? Like,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, you can kind of get bits, and from say BBC and BFI archive material. I guess, yeah, how yeah, how much do you get together by yourself before you start kind of asking for
other
interviews and for
well, it's sort of chicken and egg. So we do both things in parallel. I have a team, an archive producer and a researcher, and Paul True Arthur, the editor, was sort of busying himself starting to pull all the visual elements together. And I was actually out in New York doing promotion for my previous film and starting to do interviews. I don't film the interviews. I film the interviews for Ronnie's or any of the other projects that I've done recently, because the primary reason being that I want to keep the audience in the moment. I want to sort of take an audience back in time and to try and tell the story in the present tense, as much like a drama as possible. But then the other really sort of key reason to do that from a logistical point of view is we're not spending a lot of money and resources on taking film crews around the world to film these people. So by and large, with someone like Sonny Rollins, if you ask for, if the request is that 7 people are going to turn up to his house for a 2 or 3 hour interview, he's probably going to say no. Do you know what I mean? Because he's at a stage in his life where he doesn't need to. So as much as he'd be supportive, there's a line. Whereas if you're saying, hey, it's just me in a backpack with my audio gear, then these A-listers are more likely to say yes. And I think you get a better interview because it's way more intimate. It's way more conversational. And the other thing is, if it's really brilliant, then it's no big deal from a logistical perspective to do it again. So if your story moves around, you can go back to them and say, hey, look, we found all this amazing material of such and such. Or, in the case of someone like Sonny Rollins, like, hey, we found your performance, so we need to talk about this and how you felt about London and everything. So it's about staying agile and planning. So I still plan. I write a script. I sort of kind of religiously go through that so that we have at the very least a beat sheet of everything that we're aiming for, which then turns into cards on the table, which go on the wall in the edit suite, and then we start trying to populate these scenes with material. So by day one, there's a map of the scenes with no material or interviews, but we know that we're aiming to get an even spread across all of that subject matter. That's the plan. And then you just know that plan might be going brilliantly on a Monday, and then by Wednesday the whole thing's changed. But it's that thing of, you need the plan to fall back on.
Yeah,
it will change, but you can't ask an entire crew just to kind of crack on without some semblance of an idea of what you want to do. So I'm a big fan of over planning almost to start with.
Okay. And in the beginning, you said like a part of your kind of desire was to kind of like introduce Ronnie Scott's to like a younger audience in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in our time now, we have, many more music festivals than we've had before, albeit that's in contrast to sort of the closing down of many music venues within London. I mean, how have you found? Do you think there's among young people who are kind of intently listening to music or going to live music performances, is Ronnie Scott's are they aware of Ronnie Scott's and that sort of legacy, or not?
I don't think they are, to be honest. I don't think. I think in London, you've got Ronnie Scott's, you've got the Jazz Cafe in Camden and the Vortex as well, and they're the sort of. I mean, I apologise for the venues that I've missed out, but they're for me they're the three that I frequent the most. But they all offer different things, and I think now that there's these artists coming out of bedrooms with there's an amazing resurgence of jazz, young players, like really young players, not kind of in their teens even, coming out playing amazing music. But I don't know, I feel like there is a disconnect, just culturally. I think there is a disconnect between the value of the venue and the value of something, like a presence on Instagram. I think if you asked a load of players which one would be preferable, I mean, I'm totally guessing, but I reckon that a sort of online presence would be more important. But maybe I'm wrong. One of the things that I love about releasing docs like this is hopefully I get to have the conversation continues, and it promotes conversations like this one. And that question is something I don't know the answer to. I think venues, we're going to lose venues. That's what I've been told by the people that know that we're going to lose some amazing venues. In a way, that might be the wake up call that we need. If there is a positive to take from this year, is that we were slightly sleepwalking into the same conclusion that these places can't continue as they were going in 2019 either. So this has sort of supercharged the conversation to a bit of a fork in the road here, where what do we do about these places? Do we want them to be in receivership of government help to the point where they are owned by the government in one way or another? It's tricky, and Ronnie's is kind of unique, and why it's so special, I think, is it is. I think you could, if you wrote a list of London institutions, it would sit next to somewhere like all those places on the South Bank, but Ronnie's is its own thing. I think that's the magic. It's an independent national institution. And there aren't many of those. The sort of comparison for somewhere like New York would be somewhere like CBGB's, which is long gone, and stood for an era that New York is so famous for. And I think Ronnie's is the same. It's just refuses to disappear, and all the better for it. But we'll see. I feel like we're at a crossroads culturally with venues and music, and I'm holding on to the idea that everything that's happened in 2020 is, as I say, like supercharging important conversations, and it's what we do next that will define club culture.
Mm.
I think club culture of all kinds of music.
Yeah, no, really interesting point you raised there. And even in what's interesting in the documentary, the opening of Ronnie Scott's, and from moving from its first location to where it is now, it all kind of happens on the backdrop of really rock and roll, which
Yeah.
is the big music genre, and jazz at that time is fallen out of favor somewhat in terms of being the pop music
Yeah.
genre of its day, but it's still sort of endured.
Yeah.
And I guess one hopes that it still endures.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think our collective look at like live music and live music venues, and you know um hopefully things turn around in that regard. How long did it take to put together this documentary, and were there bits that you wanted to include or but couldn't, be it for licensing reasons, or you just couldn't get the right people or material at the time?
Um, so you asked how long it took. That was the
Yeah.
first part, right? So October 2018, and that is literally just me and my assistant producer working for the maybe 4 or 5 months. It's always tricky rolling things past Christmas because you have to sort of factor that in, like the momentum drops and bits and pieces, and the club is so busy. So I, it evolved from there and steadily built, and then the kind of the kind of concrete parameters, I guess, on something like this was the post. So like the editing, we had 20 weeks to edit, which sounds like quite a long time, but it's not, when there's so many moving parts.
Hmm.
And then, man, I've kind of forgotten how long we, and then we go into post, but you have that kind of little elastic moment when you locking the edit and starting post, where you begin to have conversations about sales and where this might be seen and things like that. So I think with something like Ronnie's, it was, on the face of it, if you try and sell a documentary globally about the story of a British jazz club, then I mean, people don't sort of fall over themselves to kind of watch it. And what we found was it took people a little while to find the time to sit down and watch it. And then when we did, we got all this excitement back and this buzz. So that's sort of how we played it. And then we went into post, and I think maybe did 2 or 3 weeks of clean up. There's so much invisible work on a movie like this. The artistry of the guys and girls that do the restoration of some of those interviews, and the color grading, and the sort of visual effects element to tie it all together. It is, if you saw how scrappy the offline looked with some of that original media, you'd be shocked. But
Yeah,
yeah,
as someone who done music previously and producing, even the sound remixing is very impressive. That's
yeah,
one thing that immediately hit me. It's like, oh, they've really kind of cleaned up a lot of the recording and audio. Yeah.
yeah, it was. It it's tough because, to answer your question about if there's anything that we couldn't put in, there were some instances where, as you know, like with the audio recording, you can't, a bit like how you can't deconstruct the cake back to its ingredients. You can't take a recording from the late 60s and bring the drums down, or I mean, I say that you can do a little bit, but then you really start to impact on the original vibe of the performance. So we didn't do much of that, and there were some bits that were just going to be just like crawling uphill to get the thing as good as some of the others, because when some of the stuff really came out sounding and looking beautiful, it kind of raised the game. And so certain bits couldn't come in, and certain performances we couldn't put in because it didn't fit with the arc of the story. So that was maybe the most the kind of saddest part, but I wouldn't change anything about that lineup, because it's astonishing that we managed to get who we did in that film. But there are bits and pieces that you can't get in there, but that doesn't make me upset. That kind of makes you think, okay, well, if this stuff can't make it in, then we've got to be doing something right. You know, if we're leaving Jeff Beck out playing, you know, like some beautiful guitar solos and bits and pieces, then there's got to be some brilliant music in there if we're keeping him on the shelf, and you know, things like that, and Art Blakey and all those people. But the hardest part was selecting performances and tracks in a way that would support the arc of the story, about the ups and downs of the club and Ronnie's mental state, and then working with, I had the best composer on this, Alex Hefez. I was so nervous about what we were going to do, because we got to the point where we started to have these musical performances locked in, and there aren't many people that are adept at writing music for film, but with that kind of traditional jazz leaning as well, with the right instrumentation and finding the right people. And he just kind of came over from LA and recorded it in London, and just after about 5 minutes I knew I was in the best hands here. And it just takes all your hard work and just elevates it to something that is beyond what you hoped it would be at that point. And that was the ultimate sort of collaboration for me in my career so far, is to have someone like him come and, you know, work his magic across your project.
Awesome. And finally, like, what would you hope audiences take away from the film?
I hope that people come to it and realize that jazz is it's a very open-minded art form. So I think some people, when you say jazz, they think maybe in sort of academic music, a closed-off music, and a very passionate but quite insular group of people that appreciate it. And what I discovered is that could not be further from the truth. You know, these kinds of places love music in all forms. Jazz is a very forward-thinking medium, so it stands to reason that they will try almost anything. And someone like Ronnie's is the platform for experimentation and moving forward. That I hope that's what people come to realize, that they will try listening to artists, that they like give other artists a go, because I think you'll be amazed at what you find. And then also, I hope that people are kind of taken aback at the debt that we owe Ronnie Scott and Pete King, and that they realize there's a really amazing story of a human being at the center of this documentary.
Wonderful. Well, Oliver Murray, thank you very much for joining the Big Picture Film Club podcast. And
thank you.
I'm sure and certain audiences will look forward to seeing Ronnie's when it's released. I imagine early next year, in terms of digitally, or you can't really say, or
No, I absolutely can say I mean, it's such crazy times, because we literally only finished our run in UK cinemas today. Not like it was sort of came to a bit of an understandable halt today, because it's not happening anymore, but it's going to be on BBC Four on Sunday the 15th of November at 9 o'clock. So usually, as you say, we'd be waiting until the new year, but the BBC and BBC Music specifically were incredibly generous with the opportunities that they've given us. So we get to jump straight from the cinema to people's TV screens, and as I say, it'll be on BBC Four at 9 o'clock, and then it will be on iPlayer, which is where I hope all sorts of people just take a chance on it. That's what I think will be so fantastic about it sitting on something like the BBC iPlayer is it's a very low risk to click on it, and I'm sure people will enjoy what they see.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks,